181. Eno's Fear. On the fourth floor of the castle, defense against the dark arts was in session. As soon as Professor Lupin finished asking his question, several hands shot up. The Ravenclaw boy who had raised his first was called on. A boggart is a magical creature that can shapeshift. It sees into your heart and transforms into your greatest fear. Its purpose is to frighten people, which is why it's considered a dark arts creature. It was a textbook answer, but it clearly captured what a boggart was. Even with that brief explanation, the students at the front of the class fidgeted. Everyone had realized that the new professor planned to make them face their fears directly. A very standard answer. 5 points to Ravenclaw. Lupin clapped softly, then looked around. Don't worry, I won't let you face your fears unprepared. First, I'll teach you the spell to deal with a boggart. Now repeat after me. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, the class chorused. Very good. Excellent. Lupin smiled with satisfaction. But the spell alone isn't enough. You have to say it when you're actually facing the thing that scares you. I've seen too many people who know the spell but are too terrified to speak when the boggart appears. So, who wants to try first? Lupin didn't call students strictly in line. He chose the first volunteer in a more reasonable way. There was a pause as everyone hesitated. Then a voice said, I'll go. Eno stepped out from the crowd and walked to the wardrobe. Lupin had learned a lot from the prophet lately and already recognized the student. As a teacher, he still offered a warning. After you see your fear, point your wand at the boggart and cast the spell clearly. Thank you, I know, Eno said, nodding. He centered himself, recalling the method Lena had taught him. Around him, Slytherins and Ravenclaws alike looked on with curiosity. No one wanted to miss what Eno might be afraid of. Remember, don't panic. I'll open it on 3. Lupin moved to the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3, go! A thin jet of red light shot from Lupin's wand and struck the knob. The wardrobe door swung open. Many students instinctively shut their eyes or gripped their robes. Whether Ravenclaw or Slytherin, few were truly reckless. If something could frighten Eno, it might well frighten them too. After a moment with no strange sounds, several of the braver ones peeked through their fingers. Eno didn't close his eyes. He stared straight into the wardrobe and froze for a moment, then let out a small, surprised sound. I didn't expect it to be you. Standing there was a middle-aged man in his 40s, dressed oddly. His face was weathered, lines marked his forehead, and his thick brows gave him an air of weariness. His eyes, though clear, held a trace of melancholy that lingered in the mind. He wore a loose, plain robe and had a foot-long, wing-shaped harp tied at his waist. He looked ordinary in most ways, but something about his presence left a strong impression. I didn't expect it either, the man said, his voice flowing like a stream, gentle as a breeze. The sound relaxed many of the students, but Eno's face stayed composed. I'm very curious. Is this a boggart, or are you really here right now, Professor Hans? The man smiled. What's there to be curious about? If you think it is, it is. If you don't, it isn't. The answers to many things are already in your heart. You just need something to bring them out. He paused, then added with the same calm tone, There's nothing to fear. If I ever did trouble you, find an opportunity to throw away those 2 dice. The voice was unmistakably Hans's, gentle and unambiguous. Eno inclined his head for a fraction of a second, then raised his wand and said clearly, Ridiculous. The figure did not turn into a ridiculous caricature. Instead, he only smiled, and the image slowly dissolved into nothing. Class continued. Seeing Eno go first seemed to settle everyone. One by one, they lined up, grew braver, and faced their own fears. Eno took a seat on a bench against the wall and watched. The boggart's choice had surprised him, but he had an answer ready in his mind. His fear came from the unknown. Professor Hans had an aura that unsettled him, mysterious, and therefore a little dangerous in the subconscious. If Hans meant harm, he would have acted already. Eno also believed there was nothing of himself worth scheming over, so the real marvel was the boggart itself. This overlooked creature could do something even clever wizards and psychologists couldn't. It conversed with the subconscious. The image of Hans wasn't Hans's doing, so much as the boggart reading a part of Eno's mind. The idea that what is, what isn't, was Eno's own internal understanding of transfiguration and magic reflected back at him. It's time to study a boggart, he thought. He already had a plan. His fear hadn't changed, and that made this a perfect chance to engage his subconscious. Wizards prized the power of the mind. Most of it lay hidden beneath awareness. If he could learn to talk to that hidden part, perhaps his grasp of transfiguration and other branches of magic would advance. He felt lucky. If his fear had been mummies or dragons like others, this moment wouldn't have been so useful. Today's share. Boggart appearance. A boggart is a shape-shifting magical creature. Its true form is unknown. Habits. They dwell in dark, confined spaces and will assume the shape of whatever the person who encounters them fears most. Counterspell. The boggart banishing spell. Ridiculous. Forces a boggart to take on a ridiculous form imagined by the caster. The more people present, the harder it is for a boggart to decide what to become. Laughter is the boggart's undoing. Loud laughter causes it to dissipate into wisps of smoke. Abilities. A boggart sees into a person's heart and transforms into their greatest fear. Professor Lupin had a knack for his subject. In the Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, he'd not only taught new spells, but had the whole class confront their deepest fears. The results had been as varied as they were amusing. Draco's fear had taken the form of an oil lamp, Pansy's a letter, and, once the spell wore off, everyone wanted more. The lesson ended on a high note, and the students began to file out. Eno, however, stayed behind. "Professor Lupin, please wait a moment." Lupin turned, surprised. "Do you need anything, Mr. Swinburne?" Eno hesitated for only a second before speaking. "I've always thought that a boggart feeds on fear, but today, you saw it. I want to borrow that boggart to test it. The castle is too big for me to find another one quickly." Lupin frowned slightly, not from suspicion of mischief. He didn't think Eno would use a boggart that way, but because he was still puzzling over what had happened in class. The thing the boggart had become, a middle-aged man with a harp, hadn't looked frightening at all. "It was odd," he said slowly. "Boggarts do feed on fear. Some even liken them to a weakened form of Dementor." He stopped, looking toward the single wardrobe that had contained the creature, and then laughed softly. "No need to borrow it. Consider it yours. There are more tucked away in the castle, but they're not easy to find. I had a house elf from the kitchen catch this one for me." Eno's puzzled look deepened. He'd been wondering whether the odd result might have something to do with occlumency. He'd realized he might have 2 layers of mental defense, the ice magic inheritance having opened only the first. "Could this be related to occlumency?" he asked. Lupin's surprise was obvious. Occlumency was obscure and difficult. Many wizards never heard of it, let alone learned it. "You know occlumency?" he asked. "Yes, Professor," Eno nodded. "But I deliberately opened my mind just then and hinted to myself to face my fear." Lupin said nothing for a moment. Eno stood quietly beside him until Lupin finally spoke, firmer this time. "I think what you saw wasn't your real fear at all, but what you were willing to let yourself experience because you were too controlled. In other words, you tricked the boggart." Eno thought of Snape, and how in the books Snape had managed to deceive Voldemort's legitimacy with a constructed false memory. "So the boggart was deceived," he said. "Yes." Lupin's tone was steady. What puzzled him was not the explanation, but that a third-year student would know occlumency. Eno, meanwhile, glanced at the wardrobe with a small feeling of anticlimax. He'd expected something rare and valuable. Instead, he'd been handed a classroom prop. "Well, that's rather disappointing," he admitted. "It's not useless," Lupin said with a half-smile. "Keep it as a pet or use it for Halloween pranks, but give it a little fear now and then, or it'll dissipate. They need feeding." There was something about Eno that made Lupin remind himself that he was dealing with a student. Whether in class or now, Eno had seemed unusually composed and mature. He had bowed, stood, and waved his wand with a calm certainty that set him apart. Eno didn't know what Lupin was thinking. He looked back at the wardrobe and, after a moment, accepted the gift. "All right, thank you. I'll keep it." "Don't make a fuss," Lupin said. "These are consumables. I was planning to collect more for the next class anyway." He waved his wand and the desks and benches righted themselves. Eno, satisfied that his questions had been answered, was about to leave when Lupin spoke again, as if he'd anticipated that. "If you're not busy, come up to my office. I have some notes on boggarts. They're only conjecture in places, but some of them are interesting." Eno hesitated for only a moment. Lupin had been unexpectedly generous all afternoon, handing over a teaching aid and now inviting him to see personal notes. "I'd like that," he said. They left the classroom together. The moment the door closed behind them, a blue spark flashed inside. The wardrobe at the center of the room winked out of existence. They climbed to the third floor Defense Against the Dark Arts office by way of two moving staircases. Lupin opened the door and pointed to a wooden settee. "Sit a moment," he said, then went to a shelf in the corner. From it, he took a thick, battered notebook. Eno took the settee and looked around. He'd never been in this office in all his 3 years at the school. Perhaps because Lupin was a werewolf, the room was modest. Castle provided furniture and little personal decoration, just one old trunk on a shelf. Lupin returned and handed him the notebook. "These are my notes, all handwritten. I can make you a copy. There's more than just boggarts in here." Eno opened the book at once. The first page showed a large black dog, then the pages cataloged an array of dark creatures: redcaps, banshees, poltergeists, vampires, along with spells and some of the folklore surrounding them. He read the section on boggarts, an incorporeal creature that feeds on fear. The beginning was standard, but the later pages grew stranger. Lupin hadn't written much about boggarts, just a few pages, but the rumors and conjectures were unsettling. Eno closed the notebook slowly. "Professor, could boggarts be related to nightmares?" It wasn't that he'd lost his composure. It was that the connection in the notes had unnerved him. Even among Muggle legends, Merlin, King Arthur's advisor, was sometimes said to carry nightmare blood. That's all legend, of course, not something recorded in wizarding lore, but anything linked to Merlin took on an air of myth. The idea of a relation between boggarts and nightmares made the creature seem, if anything, more mysterious. 183. It all seemed to be connected. Defense Against the Dark Arts office. When Lupin heard about the nightmare and saw Eno's unusually serious expression, he gave a rueful smile. "I told you before, these are unverified materials, at best plausible conjecture." Having spent more than a decade among Muggles, Lupin had heard the stories about the nightmare and about Merlin, but no one had ever given a definitive answer to what the nightmare actually was. "Honestly," he continued, "there's no single accepted idea in the wizarding world. Some think it's just a magical phenomenon, essentially a particularly strong nightmare. Others insist it's a spiritual creature we simply can't see." Lupin tried to be as clear as possible. As he spoke, a silver-haired girl popped into Eno's mind, and he remembered Luna's offhand mention of a billywig. He had been lukewarm about boggarts before, but something about this conversation tugged at him. For reasons he couldn't explain, he kept thinking of that unnamed goblin and a line someone had written: "The invisible brings us closer to the truth." Like a puzzle sliding into place, pieces were beginning to fit together. But this wasn't the moment for speculation. Eno stood up. "I'll take the notebook. Thank you. I appreciate the favor." Lupin shook his head, cautious. "It's not what you think, or not entirely, but if it helps you, that's good. My abilities are limited." Eno chuckled. "Professor, you didn't have to, but I did learn something today. And some things I didn't expect to be repaid. Let the past be the past." The implication in Lupin's tone was plain, even if he hadn't stated it outright. With the serious matters dealt with, there wasn't much else to say between men who were barely acquainted. Out of politeness, Eno stayed another quarter of an hour, then left the Defense Against the Dark Arts office. In the quiet corridor, he replayed the conversation. One fact stood out. Snape had compromised, and Sirius might soon be cleared. It made a strange kind of sense. In the original timeline, Harry had been late twice, once the flying car the previous year, and once when he was ambushed by Draco on a later train. Coincidentally, on both occasions, Snape had been waiting outside the castle. Details lined up in a way that felt like design. At the same time, in the Slytherin dormitory, Draco sat in a chair staring at a familiar wardrobe. The sudden thud from within it snapped the silence, and a chill ran down his spine. "How did this thing get in here?" he muttered. He knew the wardrobe, but he didn't know how it had appeared in the dormitory. After the afternoon's practice, everyone had been inured to boggarts. What unsettled him was that the thing had arrived out of nowhere. The wardrobe thudded again, harder this time. Something in Draco's mouth went dry. He backed away, then spun for the door and ran. He needed a prefect. He needed Snape. The door oddly opened on its own, but Draco's only thought was escape. A muffled sound, and he was back on the floor, dazed. Moments later, Eno opened the dormitory door and saw a shadow lunge. Instinct made him throw up a shield charm. The figure hit the floor unconscious. Eno had no time to make a fuss about sending him to Madame Pomfrey. For a simple knockout, levitating the body to the bed would do. He cast Wingardium Leviosa and set Draco carefully down. After checking that Draco was breathing evenly, Eno sank into a chair, drained. For a half-second, seeing that shadow leap, he had almost used Sectum Sempra. The thought made him cold. If he had really cut Draco in two, there'd be no school, no trial to face, only exile or Azkaban. The possibility hung over him and made his hands shake. The wardrobe began thumping again. This time, Eno knew the culprit without looking. "Stupid fight," he snapped. The phoenix had disobeyed orders. Instead of putting the creature in its box, it had dropped it in the dormitory. Time passed slowly while Eno found a way to contain the mess. Eventually, Draco stirred and opened his eyes, groggy and confused. "Are you all right?" Eno asked. Draco blinked, then sagged with relief at seeing a familiar face. "It wasn't the boggart that frightened me," he said unevenly. "It was that the wardrobe just appeared." "Sorry, that's my fault," Eno said immediately. He thought of Draco's age. Anyone could be unsettled by something that materialized out of nowhere. "Next time you move anything, tell me, and I'll help." Draco waved him off, indignant in a way that made his earlier unconsciousness seem trivial. "This thing has to be covered and hidden properly. If anyone else finds it—" "I didn't steal it," Eno interrupted, rubbing his forehead. "Professor Lupin gave it to me. I thought it was interesting and kept it as a pet." "A pet?" Draco's lips twitched. He'd seen people with odd pets before, but a boggart as a pet was a new one. He smiled, then the smile dropped. "Though, if boggarts need fear to feed, there are only two people in this dormitory." Eno watched Draco's expression stiffen and decided to cut to the chase. "I won't leave it here. I'll take it out in a bit. Its being here was an accident." Draco relaxed, curiosity replacing fear as he studied the wardrobe. "By the way, this wardrobe can't hold it. A boggart is basically a mass of black smoke. Without someone to fear it, it will slip through any crack." Black smoke. Eno's ears pricked. It was the second time that day he'd heard the description. "Who told you a boggart is black smoke?" "Records say they're incorporeal." "My father," Draco said flatly. "At the manor, I once met a boggart. I was terrified. He told me it was just a mass of black smoke." And another time, Eno let the rest trail off. Lucius, black smoke, boggart, fear. Several known elements were assembling into a pattern. Connections he hadn't seen before were forming, and the more he thought about them, the more they suggested a single, unsettling possibility. He sat very still, listening to the wardrobe's faint thumps, feeling like the last pieces of a complicated puzzle were sliding into place. 184. The layout of the restricted area. Time slipped away unnoticed. The next morning, the first ray of golden sunlight, punctual as a painter, unrolled the sky on schedule, indifferent to the chaos of the human world. At 8 o'clock, Eno arrived at the library again, but not for his usual idle reading. He had a purpose. The ancient, solemn oak doors of the library opened slowly, as if under their own kind of enchantment, and the young witches and wizards who passed by instinctively hushed. Eno nodded to Madame Pince and moved toward the magical creature's separation zone, glancing into the restricted section as he went. He passed by with casual ease, and no one noticed a palm-sized ice-blue acromantula that suddenly appeared on the floor and, in a blink, slipped into the shadowy corner of the restricted section. It was the compromise he had arrived at after much thought. Rather than buy more rare volumes, he would temporarily place Lena in the restricted section. Her form had changed, but her memories had not, and allowing a former legendary witch to study on her own would be more efficient than any other assistance. Satisfied, he selected a few books on boggarts and left. Meanwhile, in the Gryffindor girls' dormitory, Hermione had already been awake for some time, lying in bed a few minutes before her alarm was due. She washed, dressed, and checked her timetable. "Wednesday. I'm so muddled," she murmured, studying the blankness of her schedule. 12 classes a week, and frequent trips with the time-turner had already begun to unmake her sense of time. It had only been a short week since term began, and she was overwhelmed enough to lose track of days. With no lessons that morning, she planned to enjoy the rare leisure. She sat by the dormitory window and looked out toward the forbidden forest. September at Hogwarts brought the first coolness of autumn. A faint chill rode the breeze, slipping through the dormitory cracks and sweeping away the last traces of summer. The fresh air carried the scent of trees and earth, and for a while, Hermione let herself feel the long-lost calm. That calm didn't last. "Did you hear? Eno's new book is finally out. I pre-ordered it. Flourish and Blotts says they'll deliver it before noon, and there's 10% off the second copy." Lavender Brown chattered nearby. Her voice was not loud, but every word landed like a pebble on still water. Hermione's nose wrinkled. She had never cared for that sort of noisy familiarity, people treating acquaintances as intimate friends without reserve. It struck her as impolite and lacking in modesty. Still, she knew some things couldn't be stopped by disapproval alone. She sighed and turned back to the window to distract herself. An owl was circling not far from the tower, a strong gray eagle owl with the steady surety of an experienced messenger. It tucked its wings and slid through the open window in an elegant arc, dropping a light parcel into Hermione's lap before gliding away into the bright sky. Hermione stared at the parcel, puzzled. She had not ordered anything. Then she remembered Lavender's excited chatter and felt a warm flicker of recognition. This must be the new book they had been discussing. She stroked the parcel's surface as if to reassure herself, and a small, pleased warmth spread through her. It was a noisy morning all over Hogwarts. At the owl post, dozens of small messengers set off with brown paper packages clutched in their talons. Dumbledore, Snape, McGonagall, Madame Pince, Hagrid, Pansy, Draco, Neville, George, Fred, Ginny. Countless people received parcels delivered by owls. Most of them had been bought and paid for by Eno himself. He wasn't showing off. He had a reason. If he didn't send copies out proactively, many friends would feel compelled to buy the book out of courtesy, and in his mind, that would cheapen the gesture. 11 sickles was a trivial sum for professors, but for students, it mattered. As parcels were opened across the castle, Eno slipped out of the library and left Lena settled in her new web in the corner of the restricted section. There had been a small interruption when Madame Pince received her copy and came over to ask for an autograph, but that was only a brief diversion. From the library, Eno walked briskly toward Hagrid's hut. Smoke rose from its chimney. Hagrid was likely at home, and for all his duties as professor, he still had a fondness for projects of his own. Eno quickened his pace, and as he neared the hut, a wary bark sounded. The door flew open with a bang. Hagrid's large head poked out, his face instantly brightening when he saw Eno. "Eno, come in quick. The little ones are a bit too energetic, afraid they'll get into everything," Hagrid said, trying to hide his excitement. Inside, Eno realized he had underestimated Hagrid's enthusiasm, or perhaps his interest in crossbreeding. The cozy room had been transformed into something like a mad scientist's lab. Creatures of every sort scurried and squirmed: juvenile acromantulas, goblins of small variety, flobberworms, imps, firecrabs, salamanders. Eno had no idea where Hagrid had found them all. What was clear, though, was that Hagrid possessed the usual flaw of the devoted experimenter. Once he started something, everything else fell away. Seeing the animals running loose, Eno felt responsibility prickle along his spine. After all, he had set this project in motion. If anything went wrong, it would be unforgivable to let Hagrid bear the blame alone. "Hagrid, we can't keep experimenting here," he said. "Something's bound to happen." "Something happen?" "No, Fang's on lookout," Hagrid blurted out, earnest and stubborn. "Have you forgotten the dragon 2 years ago?" Eno reminded him. "I'm not saying stop, just move it. Change the location." Hagrid looked uncertain. "Move to the Forbidden Forest?" "No need," Eno said quickly. "I'll lend you my box for a while. Don't worry, nothing in there will interfere with your experiments." As the originator of the research, offering a place to continue it seemed only fair. He couldn't expect Hagrid to shoulder everything. As for the acromantulas, control over the colony was always anchored in its first generation, which had hatched in the sanctuary. His commands would still carry weight over them, even if Lena's form had changed and she was nearby. Hagrid's face brightened at the suggestion. He stopped protesting and simply smiled and nodded, a repeated grin of relief. 185. Harvest Festival, Full Moon. Someone once said that in Hogwarts there was never a permanent topic of conversation. The fickle minds of young witches and wizards were like wild golden snitches. You never knew where their attention would dart next. By October, the castle's atmosphere had settled. The first week turmoil had already smoothed out with the passage of days. It had been only a month, but for many students it felt as if a whole year's worth of events, or more, had happened at once. The Daily Prophet's quarrels had barely died down when a new sensation arrived, a novel called The Hidden Story. Everyone was surprised to learn the author was Eno Swinburne, the same popular figure from the previous week. Whether out of fandom or plain curiosity, students snapped the book up. After all, she was their classmate. What better thing to get signed or gossip about? Many bought it as a novelty, but some read it seriously, and the story drew more readers as the weeks went on. The most talked about part was the young man of Hutton Mar's back alley, and its protagonist Azra, whose sky-pure heart seemed to redefine love and loyalty for readers. Riding that popularity, George and Fred Weasley rolled out a themed novelty, straw rings. They sold out across the castle and even found their way into Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley. People beyond Hogwarts were reading Eno's book. It was almost admirable how the twins combined learning and profiteering. The rings were simple woven straw, but essentially they were alchemical trinkets. When two wearers drew near, the rings glowed faintly, and at closer range, the lights braided together. For an extra sickle, you could pick the color and shape of the glow. For 2 sickles more, you could customize the intertwining pattern. In the Slytherin dormitory, Eno sat at a desk with 20 straw rings arranged before him. This was the second batch he had finished that evening. He tapped his wand, and the rings floated into the storage cabinet, joining hundreds already there. Watching them nestle together, Eno smiled a little. The rings would not be lonely. He glanced at the clock. Exactly 9 o'clock, half an hour before curfew. That was why he'd waited. Tonight the moon would be fullest. He stood slowly and left the dormitory, each step making him less and less visible until he vanished entirely. He had invented a new kind of invisibility by combining the disillusionment charm with studies in the ancient runes of concealment. This disillusionment did away with mere optical camouflage. It achieved a full concealment with an effect like an invisibility cloak. By the Black Lake, a figure materialized on the empty grass. 3 terracotta pots, like those used in herbology, appeared with him. The origins of the Harvest Festival were murky, but a common theory traced it back to the 5th century. Like its origin, the festival's timing shifted with the harvest moon, which follows the last full moon of September. Tonight, after days of waiting, the harvest moon had finally come. A bright silvery moon hung high in a deep velvet sky, its light spilling over the lake like a soft veil. Eno sat cross-legged with the pots, each planted with a single magic bean, before him. He had almost stayed away. He'd always assumed plants needed sunlight, not moonlight. But earlier that day, when Snape had subbed for Defense Against the Dark Arts and lectured on werewolves, Eno had been reminded that magic often defied common sense. As the moon climbed, its light grew steadier. Eno stopped watching the sky and looked down at the pots. A small, unmistakable warmth rose from them, the joy of harvest. It was absurd and wonderful. Those empty pots, filled only with soil, could make him feel as if he stood in a sunlit field. He saw, in a flash of sensation, golden wheat bending under the scythe, rice bending with grain, and hands moving in a rhythm of sickle and gathering. Children in plain clothes ran after the adults, scooping up fallen kernels and cheering at each find. The sound of laughter felt like the crunch of dried stalks underfoot. If fire was hope and salvation, harvest was the sweat and joy of life. It was a closer, more primitive happiness, the relief and celebration after a year of toil. That feeling rose from the pots and spread like a warm breeze across the lake. It traveled over the water, through the castle, and even toward the forbidden forest. In its path, students paused and smiled. House elves in the kitchens hummed as they worked. Centaurs lifted their heads in the trees. Merpeople touched the lake's surface and felt the tug of something like contentment. The harvest moon's joy threaded through every intelligent life nearby. On the 8th floor, Dumbledore stood by a high window, his gaze toward the Black Lake. He said nothing, but a relieved smile softened his face, as if a long burden had been eased by an unexpected hand. He felt, in that small way, the same lightened step that came with the harvest. Back at the water's edge, the joy around Eno swelled until it felt like a presence. He no longer wondered whether the beans had sprouted. Something else rose in him, a sudden clear impulse, a certainty that tasted like bright luck. He drew his wand. Under the moonlight, the white elder wood glowed faintly. "Expecto Patronum," he said. Though immersed in the festival's cheer, his voice held no excessive excitement, only calm, unshakable confidence. The gathered emotions seemed to focus, knit together, and concentrate at the tip of his wand until they finally burst outward. 186, Two Different Philosophies by the Black Lake. Eno reached down into himself and let his feelings power the magic in his body. The two merged. From the tip of his wand, a spray of silvery, misty light burst upward. Those rays drifted and pooled in the sky, forming a soft, pale cloud. Where there are clouds, there should be rain. The moonlight seemed to notice. Bright and suddenly more brilliant than before, it passed through the silvery cloud. The two interacted as if in a chain reaction. The cloud swelled, then spread like a wide carpet, unrolling over the sky above Hogwarts. A cool drop fell, then another. Countless droplets slipped slowly from the cloud, a steady drizzle that spread over the castle. It washed the lawns, the forbidden forest, the Black Lake, and the 3 clay pots Eno had set out. In each previously empty pot, a delicate green sprout had pushed up, new and visibly vigorous. Eno stood by the lake, letting the rain fall on him. After a while, the rain stopped. The cloud, as if having finished its task, thinned and drifted away. "Fid, take me back." He scooped up the 3 clay pots, and with a flash of blue, his figure vanished. On the 8th floor, in the headmaster's office, Dumbledore closed the curtains, straightened his slightly crooked purple nightcap, and, without looking back, walked toward the small bedroom in his alcove. In the Slytherin dormitory, Eno entered a dark room and looked at the lowered curtains of Draco's bed. He knew without thinking that a good deal of time must have passed. After he set the 3 pots on a shelf, he slipped under his own covers. Once calm, he turned the night's strange experience over in his mind. First, the magic beans William Grimm had given him were not a lie. As the stories claimed, the beans were blessed by the goddess of harvest. Second, by coincidence, he had managed to call up the Patronus charm. He had seen it in the standard book of spells. He had thought of it as a light of hope that could ward off dementors, nothing more. He had underestimated that ancient white magic. What he had felt was larger than a simple defensive charm. The sensation of standing at the center of a gathered will, as if thousands of years of harvests, of countless farmers' joys, had been channeled and released through him. That collective joy had poured out and formed a Patronus that blanketed the sky. He also felt a sliver of fear. He had been only the guide. If he had let himself be swallowed by that vast emotion, he might have been lost in it. Luckily, the feeling had passed. The great tide of other people's joy had faded until only his own remained. He drew his wand quietly and whispered, "Expecto Patronum." A silvery white puff, about 2 feet across and soft as cotton candy, appeared and settled beside his bed. It seemed to recognize him. Its gentle glow radiated a small, steady joy. Eno closed his eyes and let it soothe him. The night passed without further incident. At dawn, the castle came alive with morning light, and there was a subtle difference in the air. The students all wore faint smiles, as if they had slept particularly well. Eno unusually slept in, no doubt thanks in part to 2 early morning elective classes. He glanced across at the rolled-up curtains. Draco's bed was empty. The Slytherin had already risen for lessons. On the 5th floor, in Muggle studies, the classroom door opened promptly at 9. Professor Charity Burbage came in, wearing light robes, and smiled at the room. She looked surprised to see several Slytherin girls among her students. Muggle studies was not popular in that house, but her tone remained gentle and welcoming. "Welcome to Muggle studies," she said. "I won't be teaching you spells here. I hope instead to broaden your view, so you'll see there's a wide world beyond our little magical one." Her voice grew more serious. I've always believed that wizards and muggles are equal. They are no different in worth. Professor, a Slytherin girl raised her hand. I agree. Life is life. But what if muggles discriminate against wizards? Before the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, in the darker parts of the Middle Ages, youngsters with magic were treated as anomalies and burned at the stake. Pansy Parkinson's question hung in the room. Professor Burbage smiled and answered patiently. You know only the history of magic from our perspective. If you study Muggle history, you'll see that many things were mutual. She hesitated briefly, as if weighing how much to say. Then, seeing the honest curiosity on Pansy's face, she continued plainly. The Middle Ages were chaotic, and the conflict between our worlds wasn't one-sided. Just as we have dark wizards, there were Muggles capable of terrible things. That is precisely why Hogwarts offers Muggle studies. Then why don't we try to resolve those conflicts instead of covering them up? Pansy asked, raising her hand again. Everyone seems more interested in hiding problems than fixing them. Hermione, listening from the corner, frowned almost imperceptibly. The question reminded her of Eno's offhand example the other night, the long-lived white mice he had mentioned, and of a little blurb she'd seen in a magazine feature she'd been reading for fun. Xiao Di's magical creature share of the day. Magical creature share of the day. Plimpy British Ministry of Magic. Classification XXX. Appearance. The Plimpy is a spherical, mottled, fish-like magical creature with 2 long legs ending in webbed feet. Habits. Plimpies inhabit deep water lakes and patrol the lake bottom, searching for food. They particularly favor water snails. Abilities and uses. The Plimpy is not especially dangerous, though it will nibble at swimmers' feet and clothes. 187. Ancient Magic. Professor Burbage sat in the Muggle Studies classroom with a small, private bitterness. After so many years at Hogwarts, she had learned to tell when students were really paying attention, and this year she had found 2 who genuinely were. Not just studying for a certificate, but engaged. Hermione Granger had her hand up and, with the professor's permission, voiced a concern aloud. Professor, I think some approaches are dangerous, Hermione said. If 2 people have been nursing a grudge for a long time, the safest course is to keep them apart, not force a face-to-face confrontation. Though Hermione addressed Burbage, everyone understood who she was referring to. Daphne sat in the class as well, looking like someone waiting for a show to begin. Burbage, unruffled, simply steered the lesson to a safer topic, the workings of Muggle telephones, and the tension eased. At the same time, Eno had finished his morning ablutions and hurried to the Ancient Runes classroom early. Bathsheba Babbling, the professor for the subject, had a reputation for being low-key. Rumors said she came from a magical bloodline and had changed very little in appearance over the years she'd taught at Hogwarts, but Eno cared little for gossip. He liked the subject matter. Ancient Runes was almost deliberately unpopular, only 2 lessons a month, and so far, a month into term, the students had only covered the history of the runes. The large classroom felt half empty, leaving him time to review his notes. Ancient Runes, or runes, were a script suffused with magic, the origin of ancient magic itself. Over time, they had been largely superseded by Latin and the old magics replaced by modern spells. Eno was absorbed in his textbook and unaware of the room filling until Professor Babbling's clear voice called, "Children, please pay attention. Today we will officially begin studying ancient runes." She drew a curious symbol on the blackboard, a vertical line with 2 short slanted bars rising from its right side. This is the first rune, she explained. Its sound is F. It originally stands for livestock, cattle, success, wealth, prosperity, abundance. Babbling spoke from the podium, and Eno, who usually paid strict attention, found himself drifting. He remembered Charm's class 2 years ago, the levitation charm, when a student, Balufio, mispronounced the final syllable and a falling, enchanted ox gored him. That fatal syllable had also been F. It seemed that even as magic modernized, echoes of the old runes remained. He also thought of his own experiments with the disillusionment charm, renaming Phantom Trace to Phantom Concealment had deepened its effect. Improvements raised new questions. When Babbling paused, Eno raised his hand. "Professor," he said, "ancient runes are magical. Is that power inherent to the runes themselves, or is it something wizards give them?" Over the summer, I studied the runes privately and used them to improve a spell. He glanced at the class and then, deliberately, demonstrated the change he'd made to the disillusionment charm. Babbling looked encouraging. A subtle question. She walked to the board and, instead of chalk, tapped the board with the tip of her wand and wrote the same rune again. "Do you feel the difference?" she asked. The handful of students, 7 or 8 in all, closed their eyes and concentrated. The rune written with chalk looked plain. The rune traced with the wand seemed to carry a presence, an impression that prickled at the edges of perception. Eno spoke first. "The rune written with the wand, it feels imbued." Babbling watched the students' faces, waiting until several showed signs of sudden understanding. "Think of ancient runes as you might think of a wand," she said. "The runes possess magic, but they still need a wizard to unleash it. That is why Hogwarts offers this course. Charms teaches you how to use a wand. Ancient runes teaches you how to use runes." She drew her wand and pointed it at herself. Under their eyes, her figure faded from view. Eno watched with renewed respect. He had underestimated not only magic, but the depth of the professor's knowledge. After a short disappearance, she reappeared in the classroom. Rick's The Invisible Book of Invisibility explained concealment so thoroughly that the book developed a powerful self-concealing enchantment, Babbling murmured with a faint chuckle and a brief, fond look. She sobered quickly. "The most important thing about ancient runes is deep understanding. Remember that. Without a thorough comprehension, you cannot use them. Just because you write or recite a rune does not mean it will produce power. You must grasp its meaning, its content, its metaphor." Eno's understanding began to coalesce. Knowledge, in the truest sense, was the key that connected a wizard to the magic in the runes. The 24 runes plus the so-called blank rune could generate great effects, but only when the user had the corresponding understanding. Without that key, a rune to a young wizard was like a wand to a muggle, just a stick. Babbling invoked Norse myth. Odin's hanging on the tree for 9 nights was not merely a quest for power, but an attainment of the wisdom of the runes. It was the same principle: understanding enables use. Eno found himself thinking of Rowena Ravenclaw, emblem of the raven, a scholar who became a legendary witch and founder of Hogwarts. Time passed, and Babbling continued, explaining the sliver of meaning behind F. How deeply any student could dig into it was up to them. At the end of the hour, she gave them an assignment. "Before the next lesson, each of you will hand in a self-created F. It may be on parchment or fashioned as an amulet. How you present it is your choice." She left with no further fuss. The students left the classroom with smiles. For once, an assignment that felt like the right kind, small, focused, and full of possibility. 188. Snake-shedding notes. In the Ancient Runes classroom, Eno watched the contented third years and shook his head. It was the perfect illustration of an old saying, sitting on a fortune and not knowing it. The knowledge Odin won by hanging himself on the world tree for 9 nights, knowledge so treasured that Lady Ravenclaw accepted the nickname Greedy Raven for it, yet only 7 or 8 students in the entire third year had chosen to study it. Even more absurd, those few weren't thrilled by the discovery of something rare. They were happy because the homework was easy. He couldn't interfere with other people's choices. Everyone paid the price for their own decisions. Just as he was about to pack his things, a clear voice came from behind him. "You actually saw that book?" Eno turned, smiling. "Of course, I hope the bookstore manager doesn't collapse into a melodramatic fit when he finds out." Hermione didn't answer aloud, but her eyes widened and her face betrayed an urge to speak that she then swallowed. The hesitation and the small expressions were enough. Eno understood perfectly, and he had no intention of showing her the book just yet. What had this girl become in 1 month? She looked exhausted. Her eyes were rimmed with red. "I'll show it to you over the summer," he said quietly. "Not now. Right now, you need to get yourself under control." Hermione bit her lip. Her voice trembled with a mixture of helplessness and reproach. "I know I'm a mess, but I can't help it." Her gaze wavered. She almost said the word, time turner, but stopped. Eno kept his promise. He wouldn't press her. Still, he couldn't merely watch her burn out. "Hermione," he said seriously, "you should drop some classes or talk to Prefect Weasley. The way you're using the time turner sounds dangerous, too extreme. If you keep this up, you'll do lasting damage to your body and mind." She looked startled. She hadn't expected him to know. After a moment of silence, she sighed. "Are you saying I've been relying too much on the time turner?" "Yes," Eno nodded. "It's powerful, but it's not a panacea. You need a careful plan and limits. Otherwise, you might finish your courses but lose far more important things." A flash of resolve crossed Hermione's face. "I understand. I'll speak to the prefect. Maybe he can advise me." After a beat, she added, "Thank you, Eno. You always help me when I need it most." He waved her thanks away. "It's nothing. We're friends. But seriously, get some proper rest." She nodded, and a rare, tired smile appeared on her face. Eno watched her walk down the corridor and exhaled softly. Hermione was brilliant, but socially oblivious in some practical ways, or just stubborn. She'd improved since the original course of events, but common sense still eluded her sometimes, particularly about the time turner. If the ministry authorized student use of time turners, they'd done so under strict safety conditions. Hermione's condition looked like misuse. If every student ended up like her, McGonagall would never have let the program pass. Knowing Hermione's personality, the cause seemed obvious. When she got the time turner, she hadn't sought guidance from someone experienced, Percy, for example, but had tried to figure everything out herself. That was aggravating. Percy managed 12 courses because his older brother Bill, who also took 12, had guided him. Families passed down that kind of legacy. Hermione had deliberately set it aside to do things her own way. Still, lasting a year under those circumstances was impressive. Deciding it was worth more than idle worry, he headed back to the dormitory to write Percy a letter. Some problems required human counsel, and no matter the world, that never changed. Percy would probably help Hermione, but how he would answer and how much he would reveal were important considerations. The moving staircases carried him back. After a brief letter to Percy, Eno began organizing his notes from today's class. Ancient runes never arrived in a single burst and then died away. Their origins might be obscure, but their importance was not. Ancient runes were a cornerstone of high magic and of old alchemy. The amulet Professor Babbling had mentioned in class was an early alchemical product. In the Muggle world, an amulet might be a talisman for comfort or luck, but in the magical world, amulets were genuinely effective. Nicholas Flamel himself made some. Basilisk. Alchemy. Eno murmured and opened the leather notebook on his desk. The cover was dark brown and well made. A careful eye would notice the subtle patterns of shed basilisk skin. More striking was the book's translucence, like a ghost book, giving it an air of mystery. On the flyleaf, someone had written two symbols, the rune of concealment and the emblem of a basilisk's eye. He turned to a fresh page, uncorked a bottle of dark red ink, and carefully recorded today's lesson. The ancient rune F, representing wealth, prosperity, and abundance. As his final stroke fell, the symbol seemed to animate on the page. Looking at it brought with it a tangible sense of plenty. If this had been written on a begging bowl, I wouldn't worry about money in my life. I'd at least be top of my field, he chuckled. To Eno, the notebook was more than a journal. It was already a kind of amulet collection. He'd been practicing the emotional aspect of harvest since yesterday, so grasping this rune came easily. When the ink dried, he closed the book. It was becoming an alchemical object in itself. An entire book of amulets would be like piling grains of sand into a tower. Small by small, the effect would add up. When he shut it, the rune of concealment took effect, and the notebook thinned until it vanished from sight. Because he had made and inscribed it himself, the absence didn't mean disappearance. He could sense its presence whenever he wanted. No lamp required. 189. Acromanthus long-winged giant spider. Days slipped by one after another. Where some young witches and wizards might not notice, Eno felt time flowing like a river. The most obvious sign was Hagrid's pumpkins behind the hut. What had begun as vines at the start of term were now pumpkins as big as small cars. Their ripeness meant Halloween was coming. Eno sat in the patch, leaning against a giant pumpkin, stroking Fang's head and watching the clear blue sky. The original story, now altered by his presence, had long since become unrecognizable. Sirius had finally been cleared, and the third year felt less grim without the Dementors. Sirius's vindication fed a frenzy of argument in the papers, and Fudge had found a way to exploit it. The arrest and imprisonment had been overseen by Barty Crouch Sr., then head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Fudge, who wasn't minister at the time of the arrest, now positioned himself as the man who unearthed an innocent. The newspaper handed to Sirius was even called a portkey in print. Under all that flattering spin, Fudge had not only recovered his reputation, but managed to cultivate an air of fairness and incorruptibility, partly because Sirius hadn't contradicted it, and in the public eye, silence often reads like consent. Another compromise deal, Eno murmured, looking up. He cared less about Sirius than about Peter Pettigrew. Pettigrew had died the day after his imprisonment, no wounds, a sudden death, and a strange, relieved smile on his face. Anyone with eyes could guess who had been involved, yet no one dared expose it. Messing with a respected potion master for the sake of a dead man was folly. The sensible kept quiet. Without Peter, Cedric's fate the next year would surely be different, and Voldemort might not return in the way the cup tale later described. That was good. The danger wasn't gone, but Harry had been granted more time to grow. Eno planned to visit Sirius that Christmas and then sort out the Horcrux in the Gaunt family house, a preemptive clear-out that would make Dumbledore's job easier. With the old headmaster in charge, the coming decades might be steadier. The most important reason, too, was that his studies had deepened and he longed to see the legendary Resurrection Stone, not to clutch it, but to inspect it under an oil lamp. Whatever curse of dark arts clung to the stone, it hadn't been fed in ages. Woof! Fang's bark pulled him back to the present. Hagrid was striding toward the pumpkin patch, beaming. Eno, come look! I've bred a new species. A new species? Eno was interested. After 2 months, at last, some progress. Yes, Hagrid beamed. Crossbred with an imp. It's an acromantula with wings. Can't fly, mind you, but wings all the same. Eno blinked. Wings that couldn't fly? Decorative ones, then? He forced a smile so as not to disappoint Hagrid. That's brilliant, Hagrid. If they're stable, your name will be in papers all over the world. He meant it. Creating a new magical creature would put Hagrid in the history books, especially something based on acromantulas, which were commercially and academically significant. Hey, I don't think about that, Hagrid said, scratching his untidy hair, pleased and a little embarrassed. I just love doing this kind of work. It's good to like it. Every achievement starts with enjoyment. Eno rose and followed Hagrid toward the hut, Fang taking up guard outside. Inside a suitcase expanded with an undetectable extension charm, Eno peered over a twig-fenced enclosure and saw the little winged spiders, palm-sized acromantulas, each with a pair of bat-like wings sprouting from their backs. He prodded one wing lightly with his wand. Are they just for show? He asked. Not entirely, Hagrid said, a little awkward. Their wings can move. Well, even if they're decorative for now, it's fine. They're still young. You won't see everything until they grow. They might change in venom, in silk, or in temperament. Even if nothing else, if they're docile and look interesting, they'll still be valuable. Hagrid brightened at that. The idea that they could one day become legal pets made his beetle-dark eyes shine. Perhaps legal pet was his new obsession. After examining the brood, the two left the suitcase and went inside the hut. Hagrid lit the fire, set an aluminium kettle on the grate, and tossed 2 handfuls of tea leaves into it. Then he shuffled over, carrying 2 plates of his famously inedible rock cakes. I know you might not be used to them, he said apologetically, placing the cakes down, but it's all I've got to offer. No one was fooled. The cakes usually went untouched, but the offer mattered. The thought counts, Eno said with a wry smile. Hagrid, take it easy sometimes. Let those little ones grow before you start the next experiment. I know, Hagrid nodded. Sometimes I can't help myself. I always want to see something right away. In that, you're not alone, Eno agreed. He'd been busy with ancient runes himself, copying a dozen letters, actually sealing a dozen alchemy charms into his snakeskin notebook. Fang barked again at the door. Hagrid hurriedly shoved the suitcase beneath the bed and ambled to the entrance. Hagrid, we've come to see you. A familiar voice called, and when Hagrid opened the door, a shock of fiery red hair filled the doorway. Sharing today, Krupp British Ministry of Magic, Classification, XXX. Origin and Distribution. The Krupp is a dog bred by wizards, originating in southeastern England. Appearance: Krupps closely resemble Jack Russell Terriers, except for a forked tail. Owners are legally required to have the tail removed with a pain-free severing charm at 6 to 8 weeks old to avoid attracting Muggle attention. Habits: Krupps are fiercely loyal to wizards but aggressive toward Muggles. Abilities and uses: Krupps are excellent scavengers. They will eat almost anything from garden gnomes to discarded tires. 190. The remaining Horcruxes. Harry had been in an unusually good mood lately, happier than he'd ever been. It felt as if the last 14 years had been a nightmare and he had finally woken up. Not only had he gained a godfather, but the person responsible for his parents' deaths had died in Azkaban. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. Maybe people grew restless when they were happy, and Harry was no different. With some free time, he and Ron decided to visit Hagrid's hut. When they knocked, the first thing they saw was another person sitting in a chair, someone who had played a key part in everything that had happened. "Good morning, Eno," Harry called cheerfully. "Long time no see, Harry. And Mr. Weasley." Eno replied with a smile. The boy who had once been perpetually worried finally showed his true self. They sat down, and Ron immediately fixed Eno with a look, putting on a mock-serious air. "If you ask me, you should be charging George and Fred royalties. They've made a fortune selling those straw rings. I reckon they've made at least 5 galleons in profit." He drew a large circle in the air with both hands, sounding as if he were doing Eno a favor. For a moment, it seemed like genuine concern. Harry turned his head away, helpless. Ron had been bringing this up more than once lately. He knew he shouldn't judge his friend too harshly, but jealousy wasn't a good look, especially when the object of it happened to be your own brother. Eno had no trouble reading Ron's meaning, but times had changed. He no longer looked at others through the lens of whatever backstory they might have had. "Thanks for your concern, Mr. Weasley," he said lightly. "George and Fred did come to see me about it. I authorized them to make the straw rings, and I'm actually a shareholder in their future joke shop." This wasn't an offhand fabrication. George and Fred had come to him earlier, long before the story became popular. They'd seen a business opportunity and negotiated production rights for a 30% profit share. Otherwise, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes in Diagon Alley wouldn't have come to him for stock. The straw rings weren't alchemical wonders. The twins made money because they had the exclusive rights. It was a small thing, and Eno hadn't thought much about it, but since Ron had brought it up, he clarified it for their sake. When Ron heard about the copyright and profit share, his face froze. It was a while before he looked away, sulking. Harry suppressed a laugh and dropped his eyes. Hagrid, returning with a tray of boiling tea, saved Ron from his embarrassment, whether by chance or design. 4 thick ceramic mugs, almost like small soup bowls, were set on the table. Steam rose and the scent of tea filled the hut. Eno didn't fuss. He picked up his mug and sipped, which left Ron staring. He offered no explanation. After setting the mug down, he tapped his index finger lightly on the table, and the other 3 cups visibly stopped steaming. "Merlin's socks! This is so handy!" Ron gushed, grabbing his mug and draining it in one go. Harry only nodded. He felt increasingly as if he'd been taking a slipshod charms class. Over 3 years, they'd learned only a handful of spells, many of them things he hardly used. Eno noticed the change in their expressions, but said nothing. The Hogwarts library didn't charge an entrance fee, after all. If you didn't go looking for certain things, advice or knowledge might as well be wasted. Some things could be left unsaid, but others had to be handled. "Harry, if it's not too much trouble, could you write to Sirius for me? I'd like to see him over the Christmas holidays." Time had dulled his fear of Lord Voldemort. Some matters simply needed to be settled. "Of course, I'll write to my godfather. He'll be thrilled." Harry agreed with a smile, already thinking about Sirius's reply. With that sorted, Eno leaned back and listened as Ron drifted into a long, excited account of the castle's recent happenings. They were trivial stories, but they carried the easy contentment of school life, petty squabbles, laughter, scolding, the small things that made up youthful days. As Ron talked, Eno's thoughts wandered. Some people, lost in time, were best left lost. Since certain names had already been declared dead, there was no need to stir up trouble on their account. Of the 7 Horcruxes, apart from Nagini, Harry himself, and last year's diary, the rest were precious artifacts, relics belonging to 3 legendary wizards and the Resurrection Stone from the Deathly Hallows. For both public and private reasons, they could not be ignored. Time hid not only forgotten people, but also hidden things. The basilisk that had once been Salazar Slytherin's weapon was a perfect example. He hadn't dared try before. He lacked the confidence. Now he had a phoenix and could move more freely. It was time to prepare. While Ron rambled on, his eyes constantly flicked about, energized by the fact that both Hagrid and Eno were listening. His voice rose and fell theatrically. He rounded off his tales with a flourish of rumor and exaggeration. Of the 4 in the hut, only Harry was forced to endure the steady stream of chatter. Hagrid, though he wore a patient expression, had already drifted mentally off to thoughts of Acromantulas. Eno felt the same way. Listening to Ron's continuous narration had the soporific quality of a bedtime story played through headphones. He didn't notice how long he'd been listening before his eyelids grew heavy and his breathing slowed. He slept soundly. When Eno opened his eyes again, the hut was empty, except for Fang, obediently lying at his feet. Through the window, the sky looked like afternoon. Time didn't matter much. With only 2 electives, he often had at least 1 relaxed day a week, sometimes even a day without classes. He scratched Fang behind the ears, rose, and went for the door. As he stepped outside, a large black swan landed nearby, and after a brief pause, spread its wings and flew off toward the distant castle. Fang padded to the doorway and sat, dutifully guarding the only exit. Eno took off at a steady pace for the astronomy tower. From there, it was the shortest and most convenient route to the 8th floor of the castle, quicker than any long trek and easier than climbing the stairs. He could have cut even shorter by entering Ravenclaw Tower, but his only friend there was Cho, and he wasn't about to sneak into the girls' dormitory for a shortcut. If he did, it would probably make tomorrow's daily profit. 3 years later, Eno stepped into the room of requirement again. This time it was no longer a world of ice and snow, but a chaotic maze. The vast chamber was crammed with all manner of things: old books, broken wands, damaged joke props, and objects that were better left unexamined. A thin layer of dust lay over everything, lending an air of age and secrecy. Eno held an oil lamp in one hand and his wand in the other, picking his way through the clutter. The place was enormous. He walked for more than 10 minutes and still hadn't reached a wall. "This is hopeless. Time for the clumsy method," he muttered, and reluctantly pulled a 6-sided die from his pocket. When in doubt, he divined. A simple revelio hadn't even been an option. Voldemort wouldn't be so careless as to leave his safeguards obvious. If a basic revealing charm could find it, the Dark Lord would be a fool. Instead, Eno marked out 8 squares on the floor with a tracing charm, using himself as the origin and testing each direction in turn. Half an hour later, he found it, a strange statue crowned with a diadem, half buried among a tangle of potion bottles. Ravenclaw's diadem gleamed in the oil lamp's light, an elegant semicircular crown, pointed at the top as if reaching for the sky. A rhomboid sapphire was set in its center, reflecting the lamp into a starry shimmer. As with all beautiful things, danger lingered nearby. A foot above the diadem swirled a mass of inky black smoke. Even from a distance, it radiated palpable malice. It was not hard to imagine what would happen if someone foolishly put it on. "This is tricky," Eno frowned, stepping back a few paces. A Horcrux it was not, so Fide was out. He considered the flame of hope. Fire might destroy the darkness, but it would likely destroy the diadem too. There was, of course, the safe option, handed over to Dumbledore. While he hesitated, a human face formed, briefly and subtly, in the black mist above the diadem. "Aha! Senior Tom shows himself," Eno said under his breath. "Thank you for the reminder." He raised his wand. The 13-inch Elder Wand lifted the diadem as if by its own will, and then Eno vanished from the room. He reappeared in a small sanctuary. A piercing, otherworldly wail cut through the air the moment the diadem left its resting place. Then, as if by a switch, the sound stopped and an uncanny silence returned. Under the oil lamp's glow, the malignant black smoke that had clung to the diadem was gone. He reached out and lifted it. Though it looked metallic, the diadem was surprisingly light, as if woven from leaves. On its underside, he read Lady Ravenclaw's motto, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." Without hesitation this time, he set the diadem on his head. The instant it touched his temples, a pleasant, cooling sensation swept through him, refreshing and clear, like iced lemonade on a hot day. The feeling was familiar. "Felix Felicis," he murmured, smiling in admiration, then took it off. The diadem did not increase wisdom. It could not. But it gave the wearer a surge of insight while thinking, an inspired clarity, not as potent as Felix Felicis, but similar in kind. And as with any strong magic, he knew it likely came with a cost. Powerful effects rarely came for free. Just as one could not continuously drink Felix Felicis within 6 months, a tool that sharpened thought must have a price of its own. So when the answer presented itself, he removed the diadem decisively. He turned the lamp over the sapphire and inspected it closely. Strong magical artifacts often concealed finer secrets. Under careful scrutiny, he discovered 12-minute symbols engraved around the gem. They resembled ancient runes, but far more complex than those carved into the basilisk's eyes. The 12 runes joined end to end in a perfect circle, an Ouroboros. Unlike Voldemort's dark mark, this was a genuine alchemical Ouroboros, not merely the self-devourer people talked about, but a symbol of self-reference and infinite recurrence. Those two meanings matched Lady Ravenclaw's ethos perfectly: self-reference for extreme introspection and the endless loop for boundless wisdom. "Fide, take me back to the dormitory," Eno called. A blue stream of light flashed, and when he opened his eyes, he was on his four-poster bed. Fide's intelligence had improved over time. It now recognized places and rarely made mistakes delivering people. He might not have trusted it to wander at first, but by now he could. Sitting up, Eno went to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a vial of dark red ink made from basilisk blood. By the light of his oil lamp, he copied the 12 symbols from the diadem, painstakingly reproducing them even though he didn't yet understand their full meaning. Copying them down was the right first step, and he already had a plan for what to do next. On the arid continent, in the Alchemist Guild of Hutton Mar, President Nuodun was the perfect candidate for an exchange. Trade Ravenclaw's secrets for the disassembler he sought. By equivalent exchange, no one could refuse. After all, true time reversal, true immortality, is irresistible. If one could live long enough, perhaps there was nothing left unsolvable. 192. False Prophecy, Slytherin Common Room. Draco sat back on the sofa after divination, still mulling over the afternoon's class. It had been an unexpectedly good experience. The professor's eccentric clothes had put him off at first, but her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly pleasant. She had shaken her messy hair and declared that Scarhead would not live past next year. At the time, Draco had found Harry's terrified expression amusing. Now that the moment had passed, he felt a faint, inexplicable loss. "Something on your mind?" a voice beside him asked, pulling Draco out of his thoughts. He turned to find Astoria, Daphne's younger sister, and a second year, watching him. Before he could answer, she went on, apologetic and soft. "Sorry to interrupt. You just looked unhappy." "No, nothing. Just daydreaming," he lied. There was something about Astoria that always made him uneasy. She leaned closer and spoke again in that same calm voice. "You don't need to worry too much. Being able to see the sun, breathe fresh air, run around, those are simple things a lot of people would give anything for." It was ordinary advice, but the quiet sorrow behind it pricked him. He felt suddenly claustrophobic, anger and helplessness coiling together until he didn't know where to begin. By the time he'd collected himself, Astoria had gathered her robes and moved to the other side of the room. "What's going on?" he muttered, irritated. Between Scarhead and Astoria, he felt unnerved and oddly blocked. In the dormitory, Eno sat alone on a chair, a crown on his head. An open invisible notebook lay before him, pages filled with copied symbols from the basilisk's eyes. "Gaze, death, petrification," he muttered under his breath. Having a crown that worked almost like Felix Felicis helped, but deciphering an unknown rune was still difficult, like asking someone with no training to translate cuneiform. The crown gave epiphanies, like an instant search through memory. Experiences, books, sensations would surface and link together, but only if those things were already in his mind. It wasn't a miracle cure. Give Felix Felicis to someone with no foundation, and it wouldn't make them pass NFTs. At least Eno had some relevant knowledge. Direct gaze causing death, reflection causing petrification. But that wasn't enough to reverse engineer the rune. After half an hour with the crown, he had only a tentative thought that the effect resembled the killing curse, sudden death without visible wounds. He sighed and shut the notebook. 30 minutes of thinking without an answer only proved his knowledge was lacking. No matter how long he wore the crown, without new information, it would be useless. Still, he had no intention of returning it. He wouldn't steal Hogwarts property, but borrowing it for a good long while as compensation for purifying it, that he could justify to himself. Just then, the dormitory door burst open. Draco came in, annoyance written on his face, which softened into surprise. Eno still looked like himself, in black robes, but the crown made his entire presence impossible to ignore. He gave off something cool and unearthly. If Draco had visited Middle-earth, he might have called it the air of an elven king, noble, aloof, a little frosty. Those amber eyes were especially unnerving. Draco found he didn't want to meet them. Under their scrutiny, he felt exposed, as if he had no secrets at all. Seeing Draco, Eno removed the crown and set it on the table. Blue light flickered, and it vanished. He smiled lightly. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's wrong?" "Just divination this afternoon," Draco said, coming back to himself and recounting the session. Malfoy discipline, never ask questions you shouldn't, kept him from staring at the empty space where the crown had been. He pretended he hadn't noticed anything. That discretion was, unbeknownst to Draco, one of the things Eno liked best about him. Satisfied, Eno changed the subject. "Trelawney? What did she say? Predict your death?" "She didn't say mine. Scarhead's." Draco's irritation flared again. "She said Harry won't live past next year." Instead of being subtle, she went straight for drama. Eno's expression was amused. "She does that a lot." Draco explained the details. Unlike Draco's worried face, Eno was relaxed. From what Draco described, Trelawney hadn't been in a true prophetic trance. It sounded more like a dramatic performance than a genuine prophecy. "Ask the upperclassmen what she's predicted in the past and how often she's been right," Eno suggested. "Most of what she says is hot air." "You mean she lies?" Draco's shoulders dropped with a relieved exhale as he absorbed the possibility. "Not lies so much as theatricality." Eno spread his hands. "But if you ever see her go into a real seizure, grow quiet, voice changing, then you should pay attention." The warning, casual as it was, landed with Draco like something to memorize. He nodded solemnly. "Shouties share today." Abraxan appearance. Abraxans are a breed of winged horse, enormous and powerful, with light-colored coats, white manes, and distinctive red eyes. Habits. Madame Maximie's Abraxans reportedly drink only single malt whiskey. They require handlers of great strength and temperament. Abilities and uses. Abraxans are capable of pulling carriages in flight. 193. First-time alchemy. 2-meter staff days passed uneventfully, and in the blink of an eye, it was early November. On Halloween, in the Slytherin dormitory, Eno studied the materials laid out on the table. A grimy mat and a wooden staff over 2 meters long, about as thick as a baby's arm. He was pleased with what he had, unicorn tail hair and rowan branches, all gifts from Hagrid. Today he planned to make his first alchemical item. A week of intense study in the library had given him a working understanding of alchemy. Strictly speaking, alchemy had been a last resort. The Ancient Runes Treatise, that thick dictionary, already covered everything known. For what remained unknown, if it wasn't in that dictionary, even the Hogwarts library wouldn't have a book about it. Left with no choice, he had opened the door to alchemy in the hope of finding lost knowledge. Alchemy was really another application of ancient runes, but over the centuries, it had become a discipline in its own right. Alchemists used runic symbols as components, embedding them into items by special techniques to form powerful rune circuits that produced surprising effects. In some ways, it was like Muggle electronics, simple logic gates combined into complex circuits. Alchemy's foundation was the 24 runic letters, plus the so-called empty stone. Arranged and combined according to mysterious rules, they produced complex alchemical artifacts. A simple example, the second rune, U, originally signified fate, destiny, unknown factors. The third rune, Eth, meant thorn, surprise, protection, hidden energy. Combine them with alchemical technique and you could get a destiny amulet, an item that wards off bad luck and protects its wearer. Alchemy had three main components: knowledge of magical patterns, alchemical technique, and alchemical materials. Ancient alchemists preferred the term magical patterns rather than runes, but the idea was the same. The deeper he read, the more Ino felt how vast the field was. If it didn't need magic as the initial impetus, alchemy might have become an entirely separate science. Anyone who mastered one of those three components could be considered a master, like Headmaster Dumbledore, who specialized in alchemical materials and wrote the famous 12 Uses of Dragon's Blood. A true master of all three might be unique in history: Nicholas Flamel, creator of the Philosopher's Stone. After entering the world of alchemy, Eno had some regrets. He regretted not taking the Philosopher's Stone when he had the chance. Even if its power to grant immortality were gone, its complex magical pattern circuit would have been an invaluable sample for reverse engineering. Still, he clung to his belief that given enough time, anything could be achieved. Nicholas Flamel had 7 centuries to work with. Time could be an alchemist's greatest advantage. Shaking off those thoughts, Eno set about preparing his materials: unicorn tail hair and rowan wood. Those two were a beginner's favorites, versatile and forgiving. The hardest thing to deal with was the dark, patinated mat. Even with the household cleaning charm, it took effort to scrub away the grime. One might have thought Fang had been using it as a dog bed. After 3 thorough applications of the charm, the unicorn hair was revealed. Soft and smooth, with a gentle light that flowed along its length like solidified quicksilver. The rowan branches were simpler. The severing charm worked best. Eno's wand tip moved like an invisible high-speed saw, shearing away excess twigs. He split the main branch down the middle and began to carve rune patterns into the exposed core with a carving knife. At first glance, the process looked like wand making: split, carve, then rejoin, and in some ways he was deliberately imitating wand makers. But he wasn't using any established alchemical circuits or professional wand techniques. He was using the most primitive method: stacking rune symbols and seeing what happened. He did it to test a hypothesis, not to create something for sale. Clarity, inner light, warmth, healing, divine wisdom, miracle, 13, calamity and death, elk, fate and protection. For half an hour, Eno engraved every rune he had learned down the inner surface of the 2-meter staff. That was why he'd chosen such a long piece. The extra length let him lay out a long sequence of runes, each left about an inch apart, exactly the spacing he planned to bridge with unicorn hair. He selected strands of tail hair and began connecting pairs of runes, one above the other, forming linked loops. Rather than a simple circle, the pattern twisted into something like an Ouroboros, rendered as an 8, a double loop not unlike the dark mark in shape. He engraved, connected, and finally sealed the split rowan wood with a charm. Permanent sticking charm. A gray beam of light shot from his wand and fused the two halves together. To the naked eye, no seam remained. When the wood closed, the staff itself changed. The deep brown grain acquired a faint crystalline white glow, subtle but warm and sacred in appearance. It was unmistakably an alchemical item now. Facing his first success, Eno felt little elation. This was the simplest, most primitive alchemy possible. If he had failed here, continuing would have been pointless. He lifted the staff and tested it. At 4 or 5 pounds, it was a useful, sturdy tool for hiking or brawling. It emitted a soft light and a gentle warmth, nominally an alchemical item, but in practice, a beautifully made, warm-feeling walking stick. Any protective or amulet effects were likely latent. Even so, the success confirmed his method: deconstruct the unknown by the clumsiest means, then reconstruct it piece by piece. With enough experiments and enough time, he thought, even Ravenclaw's diadem or other complex magical circuits could be pried apart and understood. It was the last class before the feast. When the professor dismissed them, Hermione covered her mouth and yawned. She had followed Prefect Weasley's sensible suggestion and used the time turner sparingly, but the previous stretch of overwork still hadn't left her. Lately, she found herself dozing off without meaning to. Normally, after the last lesson, she would head to the library to read and rest, but today that wasn't an option. Outside, the rain poured and the sky was as black as ink, yet the castle was bright and cheerful. Halloween had quietly arrived. Since the afternoon, The whole place had been filled with the sweet scent of pumpkin. Hermione hurried from the classroom to the Great Hall. Hagrid was bringing in enormous pumpkins. Though the decorations were just beginning, many students were already gathered, forming a polite queue. Hermione was secretly glad she'd come early. Those dozen or so pumpkins might not last. With Professor Flitwick's help, the giant pumpkins were being hollowed and carved into small pumpkin carriages. The waiting students chose their favorites in turn. Sitting inside one of the little pumpkin carriages felt oddly peaceful compared to the bustle of the hall. Surrounded by warmth and laughter, Hermione let her eyes droop and dozed. She didn't know how long she'd slept. "Hermione, wake up, don't sleep, Hermione." A familiar voice in her ear snapped her awake. Harry and Ron had arrived. "How long have I been out? What time is it?" she asked. "7:15, Harry said. Seeing the worry on her face, he added, "Don't worry, the feast doesn't start for nearly an hour." "Phew," Hermione breathed out a long sigh. She looked at them both. "You two hold this for me, as agreed. For the next month, you can refer to my homework. Remember, just refer." She climbed out of the pumpkin carriage. "Don't worry, we'll just refer and learn." Ron practically nodded himself into a knot. Harry gave a small, solemn look of agreement, like a silent promise. Hermione sighed inwardly. She knew perfectly well the two boys wouldn't limit themselves to mere reference. But she had no choice if she wanted to secure this pumpkin. Asking the girls in her dorm for help would be worse. Their idea of fun was watching her make a fool of herself. At least the boys were less likely to make trouble. After a brief delay, she dashed back toward the dormitory. Attending the feast meant washing up and putting on a bit of makeup. Inside the pumpkin carriage, Ron muttered in a low voice, "Do you think she's, like, in love? Otherwise, why would she let us borrow her homework for a whole month?" Harry was more concerned over logistics than romance. 2 copies of the same homework would be hard to explain away. The professors weren't fools. "That's simple," Ron said, puffing up confidently. "Potion homework's mine, Transfiguration's yours, Charms we split. If we get through those 3, the other teachers won't care if we copy. Mostly they care that we do the work." By the time the two were dividing up assignments, Hermione had already reached the dormitory, checked the small clock again, then fished a bottle of fabric softener from her trunk before rushing into the washroom. At the same time in the Slytherin dormitory, Eno closed his book and stood. He hadn't been especially keen on attending the feast, but he'd taken Hermione's invitation seriously. She had mentioned the Time Turner, an object of prime interest to anyone serious about alchemy. To him, it was at least as complex and more significant than the Philosopher's Stone. The only Time Turner he could legally get near was the one Hermione carried. He changed out of his school robe into a deep blue costume, picked up a 2-meter Rowan staff, topped with an antique bronze oil lamp, and left the dormitory attired as a medieval lamplighter. For examining the Time Turner, an oil lamp seemed appropriate, and with the Halloween custom allowing costumes, he hoped the outfit would let him appear as inconspicuous as possible. The side room off the Great Hall, the same doorway where new students had once waited for the sorting, felt relaxed and familiar. Eno saw Hermione sitting lonely in a corner. She too had changed out of her uniform. She wore a khaki-knitted sweater and light blue jeans with the cuffs rolled up, white sneakers peeking out from beneath. Her casual, homey look made her seem approachable. When she saw Eno, Hermione's face lit up. "Come with me. I got a pumpkin carriage today." Before he could answer, she reached for his sleeve and tugged him toward the Great Hall. In the corner, Draco watched them go, blank for a moment. He'd intended to invite Eno himself for Pansy's sake, but seeing Eno already engaged, Draco shrugged and slipped out of the hall. He didn't plan to stay. He wanted to avoid Pansy's disappointment. Back at the carriages, Hermione tapped on the carriage window. Without more words, Harry and Ron obediently climbed out. Eno, following behind, admitted to himself he was curious. Witches seemed to lead things at Hogwarts in ways he didn't fully understand. But the costume and the crowd faded from his notice when Hermione reached behind her collar and pulled out a delicate pendant. "Here," she said with a teasing laugh. "I know you're interested. Don't think you can hide it from me." Although she smiled, a faint disappointment passed through her eyes. After their last conversation, she'd known that during care of magical creatures, Eno had been staring at the time turner, not at her. There was an awkward pause before he replied. "To be honest, I am interested," he said apologetically, "but my promise still stands. You can come and see that invisibility book any time during the summer." He reached out and took the time turner. It still held the warmth of Hermione's hands. He lifted the oil lamp, settling into the familiar, meticulous scrutiny of someone used to studying artifacts, and began to examine the device with careful attention. Inside the great hall, inside the pumpkin carriage, the floating candlelight threw a warm glow that danced across the curved walls and cut the air into soft shadows. With only the two of them, the carriage felt like what it was meant to be, a small, private room where everything seemed a little more magical. Hermione sat opposite, chin propped on her hands, looking at the empty seat across from her. They said nothing, but the quiet together felt like a rediscovered kind of happiness. Eno, by contrast, was all business. Under the lamp's steady light, he studied the time turner as if reading a map. The oil lamp itself was old and strange. Its flame illuminated an intricate pattern of alchemical runes. The time turner's inner circuit was a perfect circle with 12 evenly spaced markers around its rim, like the face of a clock. At the very center sat an even more complex hexagonal circuit. The first time he'd seen that hexagon, he'd felt instinctively that it was the device's core. The 12 divisions around it looked like coordinates. A memory rose unbidden. The tower he'd seen floating above the forest in his adventure with the Grimm brothers, the 12 black sarcophagi beneath it. That, too, had been a tower bound up in time. Its magic worked in reverse. The connection was uncanny. If only he'd had the lamp sooner, Eno thought with a small regret. The lamp's rule was simple and absolute. Break illusion, reveal truth. Any secret hidden behind trickery would be exposed. Items shaped by rules like that were invaluable. They revealed whatever lay beneath. That the lamp had belonged to someone like Grandma Julia, a plain farm woman, only proved the point. Pure, selfless kindness still seemed to attract miracles. Perhaps that was why Julia had possessed such an item in the first place. He let his mind wander a little further. Perhaps fairy tale odds changed as people grew older. Peter and Susan couldn't return to Narnia because they'd grown up. Maybe that was what happened to stories now. As the world aged, the kinds of tales that came into being shifted. It was only a thought, not a certainty. He brought himself back to the present so he could record what he'd found. "Fide, send my camera over." "Fide? Fading and wilting?" Hermione's eyes lit with curiosity. "Is that what you named the phoenix?" Eno nodded, then felt obliged to add an apologetic smile. "Sorry, I can't let her show herself. A phoenix born from despair isn't for public display. Professor Dumbledore warned me about that." "That's all right," Hermione said easily. "Not every Gryffindor is permanently curious." She sat up a little, leaning back in a way that caught Eno's eye, a soft curve of wool that made him look away almost before he realized it. He hadn't expected the change a few months might make. The last time he'd seen Hermione in casual clothes had been during the summer, and somehow she seemed different now. Hermione noticed his glance, and a pleased spark crossed her face. The sweater had been a deliberate choice. If you wanted to show a side of yourself, you had to make it visible. Eno's thoughts, meanwhile, were embarrassingly simple. Hogwarts kitchens were a miracle of nutrition, and girls in Europe apparently came with excellent genes. Before things could grow awkward, a streak of blue light flashed into the carriage. A compact instant camera materialized on the seat between them, delivered by Fide. Eno picked it up and began snapping photo after photo of the time turner from the same angle. Hermione peered at the developing prints and frowned. "Why are you taking so many pictures from exactly the same angle?" "You don't see it?" Eno looked up sharply. "See what?" She sounded genuinely puzzled. The photos looked like close-ups of the same intricate rings, almost identical. Eno glanced at the oil lamp beside them and sighed. Some things were simply visible only to certain people, like the rack spurts Luna talked about, things that might be real but only perceived by some. The lamp was revealing aspects of the time turner that most eyes couldn't register. Hermione's brow furrowed as he explained, then her face clouded in a way she didn't intend. She bit her lip and looked a little wounded. If anyone else had called her unreasonable, she'd have shrugged it off, but hearing it from Eno stung. Oh, sorry, I wasn't talking about you, Eno rushed to assure her. Remember Flourish and Blots? You and Harry couldn't see that invisible book of invisibility either. Her expression cleared. You mean only you can see it, even in photographs? What I see and what you see are completely different. She searched for a word and settled on the one that had popped into her head first. That's unreasonable. I'm afraid so. Eno shrugged, relieved she'd understood. Humans like to be special even while insisting everyone was equal. Hermione raised an eyebrow, mischief returning. Then you are the unreasonable one. She let the teasing roll off her like laughter waiting to happen. It's not me who's unreasonable. It's never mind. Just call me unreasonable. Eno leaned back against the pumpkin wall and made a mock exasperated face that said everything else better left unsaid. Hermione covered her mouth and laughed softly. The weariness from days chasing the time turner seemed to melt away with it. 196 New Discoveries in the Library. The third-year Halloween feast ended on a cheerful note. No dementors, no ominous black dog, no torn portraits. Everything had been orderly. Though the celebration ran until nearly midnight, Eno still made it back to the dormitory by 11. He pushed open the door to find Draco slumped in a chair, his face a tangle of emotion. You're actually dating that, Granger? Oh my God, Pansy will kill her, Draco blurted. Eno moved toward his bed, speechless. Draco wasn't done. Don't ignore me. I'm serious. You don't know how terrifying a witch can be when she goes mad. Why are you sounding like Ron Weasley, so fond of gossip? Eno snapped, frowning. He knew Draco was not the sort to talk without reason, so he decided to explain. I'm not dating anyone, he said, shrugging off his outer robes and leaning against the headboard. Even if I wanted to, it wouldn't be until after 5th year. Whether it's Pansy or Hermione, it's not my place to decide for them. Liking someone and loving someone are two different things. He took a breath and tried to be clear. The crushes and half-formed feelings that swept through school were, he had realized, a common adolescent thing, fleeting as a summer thunderstorm. They drenched you for a while and then passed. Once everyone left school and had lives and work of their own, even a once unforgettable white moonlight would often be nothing more than a nostalgic memory in the quiet of an afternoon. Draco fell silent, and Eno let the subject rest. Some things needed time to be carved out. Meanwhile, in the Slytherin girls' dormitory, the mood was tense. Daphne, uncharacteristically somber, sat rigidly in a chair. You're really just going to let her provoke you? She demanded. What else am I supposed to do? I told you this is Hogwarts, Pansy said, eyebrow raised. She flicked her gaze toward the table where a pretty weather orb gleamed. During the holidays we could. Stop, Daphne hissed. Anything but that. That's walking into a dead end. Eno isn't stupid. Malfoy has practically told him everything. If something actually happens, whether it's me or not, I'll be the first suspect, Daphne snapped. Incompetent and always causing trouble. Daphne ground her teeth. Pansy's laugh cut through the complaint, dry, knowing. Malfoy never keeps incompetent people around. Luck, maybe, but not incompetence. Pansy knew what everyone at Hogwarts knew. If you ranked someone's allies, Draco was the person Eno trusted most. Daphne was still reluctant. Pansy studied her oddly, and Daphne squirmed under the look. What are you doing? Pansy asked. Daphne muttered. Pansy let the subject drop and picked up the Daily Prophet from the floor. The headline hawked Nimbus's new firebolt. Sleek lines, powerful specs, tempting even to someone who hardly played Quidditch. Of course, attraction didn't mean ownership. Few could actually afford a firebolt. There were always people gazing longingly into the shop window, but only those who bought a broom could fly it. Some things she didn't need more competition for. 3 days later, after his only charms lesson that morning, Eno made his way to the library. He felt like he'd become a scanner, skimming through stacks, not always for understanding, but to accumulate. Once a month, he would wear the Ravenclaw diadem to organize and synthesize everything with its magical aid. The diadem's reputation for granting wisdom wasn't exaggerated. But what interested him even more than the diadem's power was the mind that had created it, Rowena Ravenclaw. What sort of intelligence could forge such a thing? Understanding something yourself is intelligence. Teaching others to understand it is something more, a kind of ability. He shook himself back to the present. On a table in the reading area lay a half-inch thick book titled The Framework of Alchemy. It hovered in the air, suspended by spider silks, Lena's work. Eno had assumed it would be another practical introductory tome, but when he opened it, he realized it was far from ordinary. The cover and title had been added later. The pages beneath were much older. Without protective charms, a careless turn would have crumbled them to dust. The content surprised him. Within that half-inch were notes in a dozen different hands, some messy, some neat. There were additions and corrections spanning generations, with touches of arrogance and condescension toward later readers. It felt more like a living heirloom than a textbook, annotations serving as a threaded conversation through time. He smiled as he read, enjoying the anachronistic intimacy of it, like paging through a comment section from centuries ago. One marginal note read, "Descendants, do not believe anything my grandfather wrote. His mind was kissed by a quintuped, which is why he penned such nonsense." Then his smile faded. A name appeared in another annotation, Phineas Gaunt. Eno knew the Gaunts all too well. A pure-blood Slytherin line, infamous and intertwined with the darker corners of wizarding history, connected to Lord Voldemort's mother. Yet here their inherited marginalia lay quietly on a library table for anyone to read. Eno couldn't help but think how wise it had been to let Lena roam the restricted section unattended. The reward had come so quickly. 197. Blood Alchemy of the Gaunt Family. Some people once joked that the day after Halloween was Christmas. Eno had scoffed at that before, but now he almost believed it. Time had slipped by like a phantom, 2 months gone in the blink of an eye. Before anyone noticed, everything was already done. Outside the castle, Eno walked alone across the lawn with his suitcase. As usual, he wasn't staying at school for the Christmas holiday. Another trip was coming up, and he was already working out the timing. No matter which story world he entered, a suitcase was essential. In the magical world, he could use the sanctuary as temporary storage, but that trick failed once you stepped into a story world. A story world was nested inside the sanctuary, like going into one room from another, and you couldn't deposit something there and come back to it later without leaving and re-entering. So before he left, he helped Hagrid move the creatures out of his box. Together, they rebuilt a small hut deep in the Forbidden Forest to house the little beasts Hagrid had collected. Otherwise, after one round trip to the sanctuary, there would have been nothing left in the box but the acromantula. Thinking of the acromantula brought the image of those winged little spiders back to him. They'd grown to the size of wash basins. Perhaps because they carried half the genes of imps, the hybrid spiders still had size limits. The biggest was only about 2 feet long, with a pair of tiny wings on its back, frightening at first glance, but oddly endearing once you got used to them. Their usefulness remained uncertain. Their toxicity and silk production either weren't present or simply hadn't manifested yet. Over time, Eno's curiosity about improving the acromantula had faded. He left those experiments to Hagrid and his endless enthusiasm. What occupied him now were ancient runes and alchemy. The Gaunt family books had opened a new door, human alchemy, or as the Gaunts called it, bloodline alchemy. The idea was blunt: inscribe alchemical circuits or ancient runes directly onto the body. Like the runes hidden in a basilisk's eyes, if you could read and master them, the Gaunt inheritance described methods to engrave those runes into your own eyes, granting the basilisk's killing gaze. The thought was tempting, although Eno had no intention of operating on himself. He was thinking of ice and snow magic. He guessed why Lena had sent the books. It came from his offhand remark about digging up a basilisk's eyes and putting them into an ice boa. After reading the Gaunt inheritance, he realized engraving alchemy circuits onto transfigured beings was a genuinely promising avenue, especially for ice and snow transfiguration. Ice transfiguration was basically conservation of volume and form. A 1-foot ice cube could be turned into a 1-foot ice and snow pygmy puff. It abandoned the flashy tricks of regular transfiguration, no buttons that became pigs, but it gained something else: near permanence. As long as the environment stayed cold enough, the results stayed frozen like Antarctic glaciers. That permanence excited Eno. Imagine ice golems with every kind of magical property. No matter how old you were, that kind of toy never lost its appeal. He grinned at the thought. Kula Diamond, he muttered, a distant memory of a fighting game character, an ice girl he'd joked about once. A card or a small action figure was one thing. A 169 centimeters, one-to-one living ice figure was far more interesting. Who needed a house elf when you could have a doll that did the work? He hummed to himself as he walked. Dobby's existence had always made him hesitate about buying a house elf. Useful, yes, but what if you bought an anomaly instead and got betrayed? Now he didn't have to worry about that. Meanwhile, in the Gryffindor common room, Harry had just signed the departure form Percy had given him. It was only a signature, but the joy on his face was unmistakable. Unlike the past, when he had no home to return to, he now had a place of his own. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, the Black family's ancestral home. Today, he had also received a letter from his godfather, addressed to Eno, and he needed to deliver it before the holidays. Ron watched him and grabbed his robe. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To give Eno a letter," Harry said, smiling. "Give him a letter?" Ron rolled his eyes. "Are you going to brave the snake pit alone, or are you going to search the whole castle for him?" Harry's smile faltered. Finding someone in the sprawling castle was unrealistic, and entering the Slytherin common room alone was out of the question. Gryffindors might be brave, but they weren't reckless. Harry fell silent, and Ron smirked while nodding toward the girls' dormitories. "Here, let her deliver it. She's the only one in Gryffindor who won't be bothered. After all, it's practically everywhere in the castle." Following Ron's glance, Harry saw Hermione coming out of the girls' dormitory. "Are you two gossiping about me again?" she snapped. She and Eno had entered the same pumpkin carriage on Halloween, and the gossip hadn't faded over the months. If anything, it had grown wilder. "No, we were thinking of getting you to deliver a letter to Eno. It's from Sirius," Ron said, half apologetic. He had invented 3 of the dozen rumors about Hermione after careful consideration. His conscience prickled. Hermione looked at Harry. Compared to Ron, she trusted Harry more. "Is that right?" she asked. "Yes," Sirius replied and invited Eno to the ancestral home for Christmas. "The letter has the address and time," Harry explained earnestly. "Give it here, I'll deliver it." Hermione took the letter without another word. Ron watched her walk off and couldn't help but snort. "You don't think she'll actually go into the Slytherin lair, do you? Look at that look. She's not delivering mail, she's making a statement." Harry had not thought of that, but Ron's remark made him realize the situation. The two of them exchanged looks and then rose, chasing after her. Today's magical creature shared by Chaude Quintuped, Harry MacBoon. British Ministry of Magic, classification XX, origin and distribution. Quintupeds are found only on the Isle of Dreer, the northernmost island of Scotland. Because of their presence, the island is unplottable. Appearance: low-slung bodies covered in thick reddish-brown fur, each leg ending in a deformed foot. Habits: quintupeds are highly dangerous carnivores with an unusual taste for humans and extreme hostility toward them. Related knowledge: in ancient runes, this 5-legged creature symbolizes the number 5. 198. Fight between girls since Halloween. Gossip in the castle had been buzzing like summer mosquitoes, and Hermione was at her wits' end. The whole thing had started with the pumpkin carriage at the feast. As a prominent Slytherin, Eno's popularity was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just his looks or his talents. The Daily Prophet had been full of him, and that hype had created a herd mentality. With all that attention, Swinburne had become the white moonlight in every girl's heart. All of that, however, turned into Hermione's problem. Her relationship with Eno had been twisted into a dozen different versions, the most infuriating being the disgusting love potion story. "If I find out who's spreading this," she thought, furious. She hated being whispered about, and she hated the envious, suspicious looks from people who didn't know the truth. Baseless speculation and gossip bored her. Sirius's letter gave her the perfect opportunity. There were so many busybodies, she would answer them with action. Holding the letter, Hermione walked through the long corridor, down the moving staircases. Harry and Ron followed silently behind her. "She's really going alone. Should we stop her?" Harry couldn't help but glance around. The corridor leading to the Slytherin common room was nearly empty of other houses. Most passersby wore emerald green. "Don't worry, they won't fight," Ron said confidently, eyes shining with the excitement of being involved in something dramatic. "Slytherin isn't stupid. At worst, it will be words. If they started fighting, they'd only make things worse for Eno." "Then why are we here?" Harry asked, confused. He'd thought they might try to dissuade Hermione or step in if things got physical. Now it sounded like nothing would happen. "To cheer Hermione on," Ron declared, matter-of-factly. Hermione reached the corridor outside the Slytherin common room. Perhaps Ron was right. Slytherin wouldn't produce outright fools. No Goyle would pick a fight without orders. She walked around the corner, stepping along the stone passageway. Most of the Slytherins who passed her glanced with curiosity and scrutiny. Marcus Flint, the seventh-year repeat and Quidditch captain, stood by with a smirk, making space for her without unnecessary movement. In the girls' dormitory, 2 first-years brought news to a fluttered Daphne, who hurried to the common room and then sat down as if guilty. "Aren't you going to do something?" she asked indignantly. "What would you have me do?" Pansy said, putting down her copy of Herodotus' The Histories. "Daphne, don't overreact. I don't want you clinging to me all the time. Sometimes you need to make your own choices." Pansy's tone was cool, and her attitude convinced Daphne. After hesitating, Daphne clenched her jaw and left the dormitory. In the Slytherin common room, Draco lounged on a sofa, distracted, ears twitching. Every time someone appeared at the dormitory exit, he looked up. When footsteps sounded again, though he didn't see Pansy, Daphne emerged looking as composed as ever. Draco rose and left the common room before anyone else. He had no intention of hunting down Eno. There was no point adding fuel to a fire. Smart people removed the source of the fire and let the rest die out. Hermione felt a small pang of regret as she walked past the silent Slytherins, not fear, but unease about the impropriety of what she was doing. Acting like this was a unilateral declaration. It might make her feel better, but it could also upset Eno. She hesitated, thinking of turning back. The Slytherin common room door opened again. A blonde girl stepped out, skin like porcelain. Seeing it wasn't the black-haired girl she expected, Hermione tried to sidestep, planning to leave without a fuss. She didn't care about losing face in front of the others. She only cared about Eno. "Leaving already? I thought you had more backbone," Daphne said, blocking her path. Her voice was sweet and cold, her perpetual smile making the words feel dangerous. Hermione drew a steadying breath. "Are you addressing me? If so, please call me Miss Granger. Politeness is a basic upbringing." "Oh, Miss Granger?" Daphne chuckled. "To my knowledge, the founder of Extraordinary Potions, Mr. Hector Dagworth Granger, has no daughter. Unless, are you an illegitimate child? If so, forgive me for assuming." The accusation was a deliberate provocation. In England, implying someone was illegitimate was a vicious insult. Daphne said it with mock innocence, and her expression made it seem like a naive question rather than an attack. Hermione met the girl's composed face with calm eyes. She saw the intent, to needle her, to goad her into anger. "I suggest you spend more time in the library so your view isn't limited to the British wizarding world," Hermione said evenly. She lifted a hand and, under everyone's stare, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. A toad at the bottom of a well will never know how vast the world is. Even when it rains, it thinks all the rain comes from its own well. Her words were quiet but sharp, and they landed with the deliberate coolness of someone who had chosen not to be baited. 199. Shelter changes. Second perspective. While 2 girls traded veiled barbs elsewhere in the castle, Eno stood oddly on the ice and snow of the sanctuary, clutching a suitcase. A few minutes earlier, thinking about the fun of doll alchemy, he had slipped back into the sanctuary from a secluded corner outside the castle. He expected nothing more than a routine return. Instead, everything felt slightly off. Eno realized that an extra perspective had appeared in his awareness, like a split screen in his senses, 2 views of the same place. The second view, however, was poorly connected, completely dark, and somehow constrained. Before he could make sense of the limitation, that other perspective registered contact. I can move." He looked up in surprise. The sensation was odd, like punching a sponge with thick gloves, not painful but unmistakably tactile. Curiosity took hold. In the sanctuary, there was no real danger. Worry and fear meant nothing there. He abandoned plans to design a doll and sat down in the snow to investigate the second perspective. Second by second, he tested it, a rectangular space. With his chin on his hand, he mapped the bounds of the other view. He could move in it, though the speed was uncertain. If each movement covered the same distance, the time differences for touches up, down, left, and right suggested an enclosed rectangular space. He glanced at his suitcase and snorted. The undetectable extension charm space in his suitcase would hardly be utterly black, unless it was in Muggle mode. Muggle mode. Rectangular. Remembering, he opened the suitcase that way. Inside were a few ordinary clothes, a small bag of sweets, and a tiny wardrobe, shrunk down to 1 foot tall. He had suspected as much, but he still opened it carefully. A faint shaft of light stabbed into the darkness of the second perspective. Inside the tiny wardrobe floated a small black mist. He knew it at once. The boggart Lupin had given him in defense against the dark arts. He had originally kept it in his bedroom, but because of Draco's sensitivities, he'd reduced the wardrobe with a shrinking charm and tucked it inside his suitcase. More than 2 months had passed. Something that should have been forgotten had reappeared in another way. Staring at the mist, Eno felt he was looking into a mirror. In that dark second perspective, the thing answered him with an enormous version of his own face, a giant reflection of himself. The realization hit him cleanly. This wasn't a spirit or a creature so much as a mass of emotion shaped by magic. Everyone had misunderstood boggarts, he thought. The black mist was an aggregated emotion. The difference here was that the one in his box lacked autonomous consciousness. Wild boggarts acted. Perhaps that lifelessness let this version slip past the sanctuary's safeguards. The boggart had been stripped of will but not dissolved. He thought of Horcruxes, incorporeal, soul-like remnants that could persist. This mist wasn't a soul, but the analogy helped him grasp how an emotion could remain. A light, wispy mist with no solidity, so it should be able to fly. The instant the thought formed, the mist rose. Over the next quarter hour, Eno learned how it moved, like a remote-control toy with full freedom, able to dart anywhere and rotate freely. Unlike a toy's limited viewpoint, this thing had an unobstructed 360-degree awareness and essentially spiritual mobility. As the novelty faded, he leaned back in the snow and wondered quietly, does the fear still exist? Lupin's notes came to mind. He had written that boggarts might be linked to nightmares, both incorporeal, both feeding on fear. That had been speculative. Lupin framed it as conjecture, conditional on a better understanding of nightmares. In truth, no one in the wizarding world had ever truly seen a nightmare, let alone mapped one, so all records were half legend and half hypothesis. While Eno pondered inside the sanctuary, the atmosphere in the castle's basement corridor was heating up. The confrontation had escalated. Daphne's face flushed. More and more students had gathered. She gained no ground in the argument and drew thinly veiled mockery from the onlookers. "How long are you going to block the way?" one voice taunted. "Stop wasting time. Read some books, then you won't spout nonsense." Hermione's eyes went sharp. Around them, the crowd had filled with Slytherin girls. Near Hermione were only Harry and Ron. Ron's unease showed. He'd seen Slytherin girls move from words to action before. Leaning toward Harry, he hissed, "Mate, if it turns ugly, take Hermione and run. I've got a lot of brothers. Those lot won't be stupid enough to try anything." He left unsaid the half-truth that comforted him. He was a Weasley, one of the sacred 28 pure-blood families. That name brought a kind of grudging restraint from some. Harry only nodded, jaw tightening. Surrounded by dozens of girls, the escape instinct polished in Muggle primary school hadn't left him. "Move." A sharp voice cut through the crowd. Daphne stepped aside abruptly, and the Slytherin girls who had been barring the way reluctantly opened a gap. Professor Snape walked through expressionless, eyes fixed first on Harry, then on the defiant Hermione at the center of the circle. Malfoy had already briefed him, but the scene still registered. Snape's mind flicked to an old memory of a Gryffindor girl who, naively, had once wandered into the Slytherin common room one weekend early in her first year, looking for a friend, an imprudent innocence he'd seen before and didn't forget. 200. Snape's gift before the Christmas holidays. On the lower ground corridor of the castle, many Slytherins witnessed a scene they scarcely believed possible. The ever-severe head of house, the notoriously strict potions master, Severus Snape, actually wore something like a gentle expression. "Professor Snape!" Hermione greeted him before anyone else. Snape nodded once, curtly. His eyes swept the corridor. Without a single word, the little snakes scattered and the whispering cluster dissolved. Daphne, tugged away by a few girls, was pulled back into the common room. When the crowd had fully dispersed, Snape's gaze settled intensely on Ron. Normally, it would have been Harry who drew that kind of attention. But after the serious incident, Harry's feelings towards Snape had grown complicated. Anger at Snape for revealing certain truths, guilt over what that had meant for his own father, so the spotlight had shifted. For Snape, however, everything always seemed to come back to a single image, a pair of emerald green eyes, a complicated look that spoke of hatred and remorse. Because of that, Potions class this year had a new scapegoat, Ron Weasley. Ignoring Ron's uneasy expression, Snape fixed him with a stare, and when their eyes met, spoke slowly and clearly. "Ronald Weasley, for attempting to cause a disturbance in the castle, you will serve detention 2 days each weekend for 2 months, beginning after the Christmas holidays. Detention will be held in the potions office." Hermione and Harry both stared, aghast. No points had been deducted, but 2 months of weekend detention, supervised by Snape in his office, felt excessive. "Professor," Hermione began on Ron's behalf, but Snape cut her off. "If I were you, I would seriously consider where those rumors came from." Ron's face tightened. He turned his head and muttered, "Forget it, Hermione. I'm fine." Snape's tone did not change. "You two may return to your common room. Do not come to this corridor unless it is important." His eyes slid back to Ron. "As for you, follow me to the office." The corridor, emptied of students, felt unnaturally quiet. Harry hesitated, then decided to follow. Hermione did the same. She'd come to understand some things under Snape's guidance and wanted answers face to face. At the potions office door, Harry looked at Hermione, torn about whether to speak. Before he could decide, Hermione had made up her mind. "You don't need to say anything. I'll ask him myself," she murmured. She leaned against the wall, arms folded, one leg casually bent, eyes half closed, watching the office door. Harry, unable to relax, found himself quietly hoping Ron would be all right. He saw, perhaps for the first time, how precarious Hermione could be. About 15 minutes later, the office door opened. Ron came out looking dejected, carrying an old wooden box. "Ron!" Hermione straightened and approached him. "I forgive you. I accept your apology," she began, cutting off the panicked look in his face. Ron swallowed. "I shouldn't have been gossiping," he admitted. "I only made up 3 stories. The rest weren't mine." Hermione's expression hardened. "Which 3? Ron rattled them off, cheeks reddening. The Secret of the Garden, The Kiss in the Rainy Night, The Love Confession in the Train Compartment. Hearing those names, Hermione let out a small, relieved breath. She had feared something worse, something obscene or dangerous. These were romantic, if silly, rumors. She looked at Ron for a long moment. He lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry. I won't do it again. I really won't." Hermione was silent a beat, then said, "All right, I accept your apology. But from now on, if you hear anything about me, you must tell me before repeating it." It was a practical compromise. If she was going to be close to Eno, rumors would follow. Better to control them than to have them control her. Harry and Ron exhaled in unison. "Oh, Hermione, Professor Snape wanted you to have this," Ron said, holding up the wooden box. Hermione opened it and found 2 small circular mirrors, about 3 inches across. "Two-way mirrors," Ron blurted, delighted at the recognition. "They're an old alchemical thing. They let you communicate over long distances, and you can see the other person in the mirror." Hermione's eyes lit up as she understood, essentially a magical video call device. No wonder Snape had been so insistent she stay away from the corridor. This was likely meant to keep her reachable without having her wandering the halls. While Hermione examined the mirrors, somewhere not far off, Eno walked toward the edge of the forbidden forest. A faint black mist curled out of his sleeve. After a stretch of control, the boggart he kept had visibly shrunk. It needed new fears to feed on. Legitimate places to harvest them would be a London amusement park or a cinema showing midnight horror films, but that would have to wait until the Christmas holiday. For now, he would try his luck in the forest. By the way, when you see this, it's the start of the month. Xiao Di is asking for votes. Please, please, big shots, cast a vote. Today, Xiao shares a magical creature, Demiguise, British Ministry of Magic, classification XXXX, origin and distribution. Demiguise are native to the Far East. Appearance: they resemble graceful apes with long, silky, silvery hair and large dark eyes often hidden beneath their fur, giving them an expression of quiet sadness. Habits: Demiguise are gentle, solitary herbivores. Abilities and uses: Demiguise can become invisible when threatened and possess a limited ability to foresee the immediate future, which makes them difficult to catch. Their fur is highly prized for weaving invisibility cloaks. However, such cloaks gradually lose their transparency over time. Related knowledge: because of the Demiguise's invisibility, it represents the number 0 in the rune's alphabet.